she would have discovered a similar model to the one that she observed in people. However, she would have discovered a much more complete and satisfying response to death and dying. And that is the response of a believer to death and dying faced with great loss, including death. So what are the 5 steps? Well, first, mourning. Mourning is the first step. What does it say in Job chapter 1, verse 20a? Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head. For that day and time, that was a sign of mourning. Job immediately begins to lament the loss of his children as well as the other good things that he enjoyed for so long. Note that he accepts as true the events that have befallen him. He tears his robe, he shaves his head, he falls to the ground. These are natural human and a natural cultural response during the time when he lived. This is the natural, healthy way to deal with tragedy. Lamenting, mourning. You know, in some cultures, the women and the men many times wear black clothing for a year. We think this is silly and old-fashioned, but actually it's a good way to separate oneself for a time of reconstruction emotionally and socially and spiritually. It says to other people who see us, don't mind me, I'm in mourning. I remember my dad, he was one of 5 brothers. There were five brothers. And I remember when someone in the family died, I remember my grandfather, when he died, my father wore an armband. We were Mazzalongo was Italian, so he wore an armband, a black armband on his left arm. And so did his brothers, to show that they were mourning. And they had that black armband on their arm, not just for the funeral, to identify them as the family of the deceased. He wore the armband for months afterward. It was his way of saying, I'm in mourning. Go easy on me. I'm going through a difficult period. Everyone understood, without a single word, they understood something had changed in his life. The worst detriment to recovery from a tragedy is to force a time limit for ourselves to get over it, to get over the loss. If you don't weep, if you don't mourn when it happens, you'll weep or mourn later. I can tell you in my own experience, my dad died when I was 15, but I didn't mourn him till I was 30. Till I was 30. Then I broke down, and then I wept bitterly, and I didn't even know why. And all of a sudden, I shouted out to no one. I was by myself. You didn't even say goodbye. And I realized it's because, well, he died and he didn't say goodbye. I saw him alive that morning, and that night he was dead. And for 15 years, I held that mourning inside of me. It's not healthy. Many depressions and anxieties are the result of improper time and effort given over to mourning the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a marriage, or the loss of our good health, or the loss of a certain family situation. You know who are the worst at mourning? The absolute worst? Boys. Boys are the absolute worst at mourning because they're told not to mourn. It's not a manly thing. I remember when my dad died, the ambulance came, and they were, in those days, they put him on the stretcher and they were taking him out, and the policeman was there, and I began to cry. And as I began to cry, this big hand went onto my shoulder. It was a policeman, and he was doing his best. And he said to me, "Don't cry. You're the man now. You've got to take care of your mother. There's no time for crying." And so I took his advice. It wasn't good advice. Mourning was all Job could do at that point. And he did it as a way of saving his sanity. In the believer's response to death and dying, step 2 is worship. We read in Job's account, "And he fell to the ground and worshiped and said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.'" As a believer, once Job could struggle to right himself from the shock, his first thought is to go to God in worship and prayer. Someone dies, someone you love dies, and you see it. You realize this thing that people talk about all the time is real. Not a video game where you're going bang, 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 bang. Whoa, I killed 16 people. That's for video games. In reality, just one person you love dies. That's a shock. You can't get over that. There's no reset for when that takes place. The only thing we can do is go to God and talk to Him. Acknowledge to Him, "God, you are sovereign, you are real, you're eternal, and I realize I'm only for a little while. Have mercy on me." It's unfortunate that so many see prayer as some kind of last hope or a grasping at straws when things go bad. Instead of worship and tragedy, many people turn instead to drink or drugs or excessive eating or abuse of themselves in various ways. All kinds of escapist methods to deal with the great pain associated with death and dying or personal loss of some kind. Who can help you with all of this? Only God. Of course, the verse here in Job does not contain all that he said. It doesn't repeat for us every prayer that he uttered. Rather, we're given the conclusion of his worship and his talking to God. We read about the insight that he first gains as a result of that prayer. He's mourned. He goes to God in prayer and he realizes, wow, I'm only here for a little time. God has given me everything and now God has taken it away, and He's sovereign. He's gotten an insight that he wouldn't have any other way. That's the thing about death. If you allow it, God will teach you many things through it. Initial prayer and worship does not always produce such deep insights as Job had into the nature of our situation, such clarity about its meaning. However, when the thought of existing one more minute on this earth is too painful to bear, and I don't know if any of you have ever been to that place, where being alive one more minute is almost too much to bear. If you've ever been to that place, the only place that we can and should go is to God in humble worship and prayer. If trouble or pain and death don't drive us to our knees, my question is, what will? Many times, God uses tragedy as a means to draw us nearer to Him than we ever have or could have been before. Our terminal illness, for example, or the death of a loved one is beyond our understanding. It's beyond our power. It is a supernatural thing at work in our lives. It's like being strapped into a roller coaster where we feel powerless to affect anything happening to us or to our feelings. For this reason, we need to come closer to the one who does have the power to control all things, including death. God may not answer our prayer to bring back our loved one, or to resurrect our marriage, or to give us back our health. But He can give us more of Himself. And nothing is better than more of Him. This may not change the circumstances, but it does bring us peace and at times a certain understanding. Job, he did this, and although his situation did not change, through his tears, he was rewarded with a crystal clear understanding of the true nature of his own life and its ultimate meaning and substance. And so you have mourning, you have prayer. Step number 3, silence. Silence. In verse 22 it says, through all this Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Although later on Job did break his silence, his first and correct impulse was to hold his peace and contemplate his situation and wait upon the Lord. The Bible explains this by saying that Job didn't complain to or blame God. He didn't charge God foolishly. He didn't question God as to the timing or the fairness or the degree of suffering. He didn't dwell on the why of it all with the suggestion that there may have been a better way or an easier way. He did not substitute a plan of his own for what had happened that might have lessened the blow. He said nothing concerning the events and how they took place. The Bible says that in doing this, he sinned not. Now, Kubler-Ross, she described the stages of grieving, as I said, as denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. And we've come to see these as normal human progressions and responses to death and dying. We should also note that for a weak and sinful person, these may be normal responses. However, to lash out at God in anger, to question His actions, to try and change His decisions or feel sorry for ourselves, all of these things are fleshly, worldly responses born out of our sinful and weak natures. The only spiritual reaction is the final stage, the one of acceptance. But compare these, however, with Job's initial response to death and dying. First, he mourned and lamented his loss. We see that within his very first reaction is included most of Kubler-Ross's normal human responses of denial and anger and depression. Next, he drew near to God in prayer and worship. He didn't bargain with God. He didn't accuse God. He bowed down before God in humility and trust. And then he remained silent. During this time he contemplated his situation and he searched for meaning. What does this mean? Eventually he developed a life-threatening illness, lost the support of his wife, and was condemned by his friends as a sinner who had brought all of this misery upon himself. Could you imagine if that's what your friends told you after something bad happened to you, that you know what, this is all your fault. You must have done something wrong. You must have done something to get God mad at you or something because He wouldn't have done this if you wouldn't have sinned. Boy, how comforting that is. These additional burdens led Job to the last two steps in the believer's journey through the experience of grief and dying. Step number 4, enlightenment. For nearly 40 chapters, in an ongoing dialogue with his friends, we watch Job as he comes to grip with not simply the reality and the meaning of his suffering, but the truth that stands behind not only his suffering, but the suffering of all men. Job learns that his experience is worth it if it reveals more perfectly the God that he believes in. In other words, if your suffering serves to give you just a glimpse of God Almighty, then it is a small matter, and any complaining is foolish and sinful in comparison to what has been discovered, what has been given to you. Enlightenment, especially the enlightenment that enables us to see God more clearly, is of more value than what we have lost, whatever that is, no matter how much we suffer. Job learned that life, as well as death, is in God's hands, and the painful experience of it is justified if it leads us face to face with God. Even if it's just for a moment, that one moment is worth all the suffering. That's the key. You see, non-believers, their best hope is to arrive at that point where they accept a new reality and they learn to cope with it. That's the best. It doesn't get better than that for the non-believer. That reality, being that people suffer and die, and there's nothing they can do about it except carry on as best they can. As I said, this is as good as it gets for the non-believer. Acceptance. Suffering and death for believers, however, brings them face to face with the ultimate reality, and that is that there is a living God who gives life and controls death by His power. The ultimate end, therefore, is that death and dying strengthens faith and hope and loosens its grip of fear and sorrow on our hearts. If I know that God is truly in control of my life and my death, I'm going to stop worrying about it, because I can't change it. Because somebody better than me, stronger than me, wiser than me, purer than me, is taking care of me, whether I live or die. Only an enlightened person, like Paul the apostle, for example, could write these words when facing death. He said, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." What was he gaining? Did you ever wonder what the gain was? He gains a face-to-face existence with Christ. So for him, to stay was to serve Christ. To leave was to be with Christ. Only a person who knows God can say such a thing. He had seen beyond the suffering and death and had a glimpse of God's reality, and it was worth all the suffering that he experienced. And then finally, step number 5, restoration. In Job 42, 10 to 17, we won't read it, but the last chapter we learn that God heals Job and restores his family and his wealth and his position. This didn't change the fact that Job had suffered, had lost children, had lost prestige. His suffering was real. But you see, God doesn't give us our old life back. He gives us a new life. Here on earth, it's a life that we can live and live with. Sometimes it's very different, sometimes it's harder, but for believers, it's always a life where God is more prominent than before. You see, God is the reward for perseverance. You may not have a parent or a child or a spouse or a loved one or health anymore, but you now have more of God to make up for it. That's the key. And in the next world, the great promise for those who have experienced the enlightenment of suffering is that you will have all of Him all the time. Because after your death, you will leave behind everything that comes between you and Him now. Your body of sin, your need to survive, your many sorrows, your earthly treasures, these things will be gone. All of these will fall away as you are restored to the perfect relationship with God through Christ that you were originally designed to enjoy. So, Kubler-Ross explained how unbelievers faced death because that's all she could see as an unbeliever. And I'm not criticizing her. She did a good work for what she knew, what she could see. However, Job describes how a believer responds to the death and dying around him and in him. He mourns the loss. He draws closer to God. He refrains from sin. And note that in doing these things, God will then lead the believer into the final stages of the experience of death and dying, which is enlightenment, a fuller knowledge of God.